this is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the In Focus podcast. I'm your host, G. Sampath. Chinese President Xi Jinping last week hosted a reception for Vladimir Putin at the historic Great Hall of the People in Beijing. The two-day summit was marked by a lengthy joint statement that, among other things, said that China and Russia will promote, quote-unquote, an equal and orderly multipolar world. The statement also outlined a vision of a new world order with, again, quote-unquote, no neo-colonialism and hegemonism of any kind. The two countries also took aim at the US, criticizing unilateral sanctions and what they termed long-arm jurisdiction without basis in international law or UN Security Council authorization. The statement also highlighted the expansion of Russia-China ties beyond opportunistic bilateral cooperation to one of deeper partnership. So what are the implications of this growing strategic convergence between two major powers, both of whom are veto-holding Security Council members? How does China hope to balance Western concerns about its aid to Russia, especially dual-use technology? And what are the implications of this friendship for India, which views China as a major threat but is highly dependent on Russia for defense imports? We discuss all these questions and more in this episode of In Focus, and we have with us Jabinti Jacob, Associate Professor in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Shiv Nadar University. Jabin, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to In Focus.
Thank you, Sampath. Thank you for having me.
So Jabin, to start with, I was just wondering if you can sort of give us an overview. Russia and China already had a no-limits agreement before Russia invaded Ukraine. And Putin and Xi have met more than 40 times. This is their 43rd meeting. So is this latest meeting in Beijing in any way more significant compared to the earlier ones? How do we contextualize this?
So I think the two sides have been building up to this stage of their relationship for a very long time. I think especially since Xi Jinping came to power, and particularly post-COVID and on the Chinese side and the Russia-Ukraine conflict on the Russian side, both sides have needed each other a lot more on international forums. So it is certainly, and this particular meeting, I think, is sort of the apex of that kind of it is sort of at the apex of the relationship, I think. Xi and Putin hugged each other, and it was Xi Jinping who was leading with the hug. They also had what the Chinese termed a restrictive meeting at Zhongnanhai, which is the sort of the headquarters is where the Communist Party leaders stay in Beijing. So this is a very special treatment that the Chinese have laid out for Putin. And I think this signifies that this is now not just a no-limits partnership, but if it says a higher stage, then that is what it is. The joint statement talks about deepening this comprehensive relationship between the two sides. I would argue that this is now pretty much an ideological partnership. It's also a relationship between leaders and systems. The joint statement actually talks about, it's one line, but it's actually an important line. It talks about exchanges and cooperation between the General Office of the CPC's Central Committee and the Presidential General Office of the Russian Federation. So Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are invested in this relationship, not just at a personal level, but also at a systemic level. I mean, apart from the fact that Xi Jinping hosted Vladimir Putin at Zhongnanhai, Putin also visited Harbin in Heilongjiang province. Now, this is actually a region on the border between Russia and China, which is of traditional Russian influence. But for Putin to go to this particular area to attend the 8th China-Russia Expo, I think suggests a willingness for greater integration of their two economies. Of course, he visited tech company here, which is under sanctions by the Americans. So clearly, there is a attempt to cock a snook at the West also. Clearly, there's a lot of trust between the two sides. There's cooperation talked about in the field of law enforcement and security. Third countries are mentioned: North Korea, the development of a China-Mongolia-Russia economic corridor, organizations such as SCO, BRICS, UNESCO, G20, and also references to the global South. Yeah, so, and also, of course, importantly, the Russians have signed on. There's a reference to the BRI, of course, but the Russians have also signed on to the Global Development Initiative, which is one of the spin-offs of the BRI that the Chinese launched a few years ago. So if you take all of this together, this is definitely a very important, the partnership has reached a new level, I would say.
Right. Thank you for that detailed sort of overview, Jabin. Appreciate that. I mean, you spoke about an integration or a convergence, not just in terms of interest, but you spoke about an ideological partnership. I mean, one wouldn't assume that these two countries have the same political ideology. Maybe if there is time, we'll come back to that, or maybe you can answer it in the next question I have for you, which is that joint statement taking aim at the US, without naming, I think they named the US at one point, but they speak about a multipolar order and they criticize quote unquote hegemonism, neo-colonialism, and closed alliances such as AUKUS. So, what do you make of this? Are they would they make for really? Are they really concerned about a multipolar order, or are they looking at a different kind of a hegemony where China would be at the top, so to speak? Like, what is going on with this?
So I think the Russia-China relationship is, as joint statement puts it, at the best level in history. And the fact that it specifically names the United States and alliances of the United States, such as AUKUS, and it criticizes hegemonism, neocolonialism, and so on, underlines the fact that this is now an ideological relationship for the Russians and the Chinese. Now, on the surface of it, the two systems might be very different in terms of how the political systems operate, but they are united by a common antipathy to Western liberal democratic systems, because those systems they see as existential threats to kind of regimes, kind of political systems that have been developed in Russia over the past decade and past couple of decades, and in China since the Communist Party came to power. And Xi Jinping certainly has become much more confident about promoting a Chinese model of political and economic development, in which the Chinese are talking about, Chinese wisdom or a Chinese model of political and economic development that other countries can look at as an alternative to Western democratic models. And this model is essentially saying that it's okay to have one single person as a strongman leader or one single party in power throughout, as long as the people's economic needs, development needs are taken care of. So essentially, a form of saying that man can live with just bread, and specific references elsewhere to unilateral sanctions, long-arm jurisdiction are, of course, targeting the United States. At one point, they also talk about the dual containment policy of the United States towards China and Russia and the Russian Federation. So clearly, the US is a target. The two countries see the US-led Western world order as well as US allies and partnerships in the Indo-Pacific as threats to their systems and to their spheres of influence. And when the joint statement talks about defending the results of the victory of the Second World War and the post-World War order, essentially they are targeting also US allies like Germany and Japan, and underlining the fact that, from an Indian perspective, this is a very clear statement that the two countries are not interested in reform of the UN Security Council, because if you had to reform the UN Security Council, you also cannot hang on to the results of the Second World War or the post-World War order.
So you basically have outlined, an ideological partnership or a convergence based on an antipathy to this Western system of democracy and elections and so on, and also the West's dual containment policy directed towards Russia and China. Now, in this context, Jabin, Russia, we know, is because of the Ukraine war completely isolated, and its need for China, for imports and so on, is fairly clear. But what exactly is the ambit of China's dependency or requirement for Russia? Because to what lengths will China be prepared to go in helping Russia? That's not very clear. Like, what is it? Because we know that she also went to certain European capitals just recently before Putin's visit, and he was trying to sort of strengthen his interest in Europe as well. So, what is the calculus through which China looks at its relations with Russia, which, I mean, historically speaking, we know wasn't really great for the longest time?
So I don't think we should read too much into the Western leg of Xi Jinping's visit to Europe, which is the visit to France. I think the real significant part of that visit was the fact that he visited Serbia on the anniversary of the US bombing of the embassy the NATO bombing of the embassy in Belgrade during the Yugoslav crisis, which the Chinese said was a deliberate US action. And also his signing of a comprehensive treaty with the Hungarians. Now, Hungary under Orban is actually a troublemaker in the European Union system. I mean, given his own lack of democratic credentials and so on. So I think that is what we should pay attention to. Even Xi Jinping's trip to Europe was an opportunity for him to underline that China is against Western democratic liberal systems, and that China is trying to play divide and rule even in Europe. So if you take that into account, I mean, if you use that as the actual sort of reality, then the Russia-Putin, Putin-Xi meeting is just one step up from this. See, this is the 75th anniversary, as you pointed out. This is a relationship that has seen many ups and downs, but they are actually celebrating the 75th anniversary of this relationship, and they are doing it in a big way. They are making it a special occasion, and they have sort of elevated this partnership. So I would say that the Chinese are much more willing to back the Russians than at any time in the past. While the Chinese have made references to the collapse of the USSR in the statement, they have also said that current Sino-Russian relations have transcended the military-political alliance model of the Cold War. All right. So I think this needs to be underlined. And the fact that the Chinese have actually have commented in the joint statement about the open, objective, and popular results of the Russian presidential elections, again underlines the fact that the Chinese are supporting a political system that they see is akin to theirs, and also something a relationship that they see as very important in countering the West. So right. I would say that they are willing to go the distance for the Russians.
Right, willing to go the distance for the Russians. Now that's interesting. We'll come to the Indian dimension of that scenario in a bit. But right now, Jabin, the West has expressed major concerns about China's role in helping Russia at a time of the Ukraine war, and the US in particular has flagged Chinese supplies of dual-use items, certain technologies which can be used for civilian purposes and also for military use and military manufacturing. And China, on paper, has promised not to. I mean, it won't supply any arms and ammunition to Russia, but I mean, it seems to be the case that many of Chinese imports are going into the defense sector. So, what are the options for the US to counter this growing partnership, which, when you just said, is one where China is willing to go the distance?
Well, firstly, I don't think that anyone should expect the Chinese to follow through on any agreement that they make with the US. They have not done it for a very long time, especially since Xi Jinping came to power. Take the example of Xi Jinping telling Barack Obama that the Chinese wouldn't militarize the South China Sea. And then he goes back and starts doing exactly that. The US is seen as something of an existential threat to the Chinese. And so they will not, at any cost help the United States in their relationship with Russia. Where the Chinese will put the brakes on, as far as Russia is concerned, I think is only when their own security interests or where their own sphere of influence is affected in some way. But I think what this joint statement says is they've more or less sorted out a lot of those issues or are willing to sort of work with each other despite those issues. Insofar as the US response is concerned, uh, the US has all the resources it needs. It's already imposed tough sanctions. It has made Russian and Chinese access to the SWIFT system for financial transactions quite difficult. So the only thing that the US can do is impose even tougher sanctions against China, because really China is the power that is keeping the Russians in the conflict in many ways. Now, but more creatively, I would say the US could back India to the hilt. The US could let India take the lead with the Russians and in Central Asia. And, if anyone can bring the Russians back from the brink, I think it's probably India. So will the Americans be willing to do that, give that kind of a leeway for the Indians to deal with the Russians or the Iranians in the larger interest of countering China? I'm not quite sure.
Right. I mean, the option for the US, as you said, is to back India to the hilt. Now, coming to India here, Jabin. So now many people are saying that Russia either already is or will be a junior partner, quote unquote, in the Sino-Russian partnership. And if that is the case, what happens in the case of an open conflict between India and China? Where 60 to 70% of India's defense supplies come from Russia, because China's influence on Russia being a big factor, and its interest would tend to be paramount in the Russian calculus, or would that play out differently?
See, on the question of Russia as a junior partner, I think this is not the case across the board. In the political relationship, I think the Chinese are still extremely careful about giving this impression. I mean, in practice, it might work out in many sectors that the Chinese take the lead or the Chinese are the dominant power. But I think they want to keep up appearances because, after all, remember, I mean, as you pointed out, this has been a relationship of ups and downs. And Russia is China's largest, neighbor. And so they need to be sensitive to Russian concerns. The Russians are particularly touchy, especially given the setbacks in the Ukraine conflict. There's a great deal of suspicion of China at different levels in Russian society, in the Russian leadership. So the Chinese know that they must not sort of push things too far. They know how to they know that they need to calibrate this relationship. Insofar as a India-China conflict is concerned, look, I think we know that, certainly at a time when the Russians themselves are tied down in conflict with the Ukrainians, I don't think Russian supplies are coming through in any case. So this is something that the Russians can say, and they can sort of play both sides and say, look, we have not supplied to the Indians. So the Chinese, they will say that, and to the Indians, they'll say, look, we are tied up, so we can't. I don't think Russia, in that sense, is a reliable partner. And to an extent, the Indian government understands this. And that is why we have also diversified our supplies to the Americans. I think as in 1962, so also now, eventually eventually the Americans will have to sort of come through in supporting India. But just to be clear, I don't really foresee an all-out conflict between India and China all across the border or all along the LAC. If anything happens, it's likely to be a limited conflict because, I mean, it's not just the Indians who have a two-front scenario. The Russians and the Chinese also have a two-front scenario.
Right. So, Jabin, in this taking this particular conundrum a little bit further. Now, you spoke earlier about this ideological convergence partnership, between Russia and China in terms of the general skepticism about democracy, liberalism, free elections, and so on. And you also, in a different context, said that one option for the US would be to back India to the hilt. Now, if you look at India, when there seems to be also, if you going by the last 1 year or maybe a little longer, there is we also seem to be moving towards a single party kind of a scenario. There is authoritarianism in the air. So, in that sense, would it make sense for India also to sort of reassess its stance towards China and the US, because we are getting a lot of flack from the US. There's no question about it for our democratic backsliding, a crackdown on free press, the largest number of internet shutdowns in the world. If you look at the numbers, hardly anything distinguishes Indian numbers from the Chinese numbers, in terms of crackdown on the press and social media and so on. So, is there any scope for? I'm half serious, but half not serious here. But I think it's a question worth asking. Should we be reassessing our stance towards China, because they are also our immediate neighbor? When I don't see how someone who is like thousands of miles away is going to come and be a bigger partner. If you're going to not have a decent relationship with somebody who's right next door and far more powerful than you.
So, I think the answer to this is fairly obvious. You look at the record in India-China relations. We might share certain characteristics. We are both, India and China are both large countries, 1 billion plus people. So we share similar complexities of administration, governance, developmental challenges. And, even if we profess different political systems, some of the methods sometimes, and sometimes unfortunately, will be the same. I'm not saying that India can't do better. Of course, India can do better, and India should do better, because I think this is an opportunity. This comparison with China is actually an opportunity for India to show the global South, the developing world, that there is an alternative model available in which you don't go, just blindly capitalist and completely, competitive like the Americans do, or completely authoritarian like the Chinese do. We can have a middle way. And if you look at the record, to come back to your question, if you look at the record of India-China relations, the Chinese have never, met any of their promises. They've broken. With the Galwan incident, clearly they destroyed 20 odd or 30 odd years worth of bilateral agreements. So, on what basis are we going to engage in a relationship with the Chinese? What is it that we can give the Chinese that the Chinese want? So the Chinese want us to sign on to the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, we have clearly said in our statement of 2017 why this is an unacceptable proposition. The Chinese want us to acknowledge their number one status in Asia. The Chinese want us to ignore our interests in getting a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. Chinese have promised us a lot of things. When Xi Jinping came to India in 2014, for example, he promised billions of dollars of investment, tens of billions of dollars of investment, but none of that actually came through. They keep promising.
We also didn't really respond, right? When BYD wanted to set up a $1 billion plant in Hyderabad to manufacture electric cars, we asked them to get lost. Didn't we do that? That's also the case.
No, I think, see, there are legal issues here. There are technology regimes involved here, in which the Chinese set up these things as long as data localization and technology control and transfer are in Chinese hands, or management is in Chinese hands. I think the Indians came back saying, look, as long as Chinese companies in India have Indian CEOs and CEOs, we are willing to do business. But the Chinese companies have to meet Indian legal standards and Indian legal obligations. That is not the case. The Chinese are, while they insist foreign companies in China should follow data localization and follow Chinese laws, etc., Chinese companies abroad are still expected to follow Chinese laws primarily. So there is a lack of security in terms of data privacy, data localization. A lot of issues are also at play here. It's not simply a question of India saying no. It's India says no because BYD is not willing to abide by Indian rules and accept the same conditions in India that Indian companies would face in China, right? I mean, for the longest time, you are aware of this. I mean, for the longest time, Indian pharmaceutical products were simply not available easily in China, even though the Chinese knew that Indian products were cheaper.
Right, right.
So,
So there is
so they
clearly a
have
double standards here, Jabin. Thank you for pointing that out. Now, coming back to this, this whole question of double standards, where Indian companies are expected to follow the local domestic Chinese legal compliances, whereas the Chinese are not particularly keen on doing so when they come to India. This is a double standard, clearly. Another level of double standard, if it is a double standard, I wanted you to just quickly come in on that is this whole question of multipolarity that the joint statement talks about. I mean, that's all fine, but what about multipolarity in Asia, in Southeast Asia in particular? Is China okay with a multipolar South Asia, or is China has to be the dominant power, the hegemon, so to speak here?
See, I think we need to accept the reality that the Chinese are playing to be number one. And in their worldview, when you have one single ruling party in power and all other parties, political parties in China, for example, are told to incorporate within their party constitutions that the CPC, the Communist Party of China, will rule China forever, then, any party, any country with that kind of a, winner takes all attitude domestically cannot suddenly turn around in the international arena and say we are for multilateralism. It simply doesn't work. It's a contradiction in terms. So whatever the Chinese say about multilateralism, I think we must, or multipolarity, we must disbelieve. I mean, the Chinese are not interested in multipolarity. They are talking about being number one in their own domestic, in their internal discourse and literature. So this is something that we need to be aware of. So you talked about Southeast Asia. Yeah, the Chinese are happy with ASEAN because ASEAN is a divided house. They can play divide and rule and one country off against the other. In South Asia, clearly, I mean, there's no way the Chinese will accept a reality in which India dominates South Asia, because the Chinese say, well, it cannot be the case that any other country can compete with us or should compete with us. We just simply have first and foremost to get this idea clear in our minds that the Chinese are competing with us. And only if we understand that will everything else fall into place.
Right. I mean, multipolarity at the global level, but not so much in South Asia or Asia even. And there is also clearly a build-up of Russia-China relations to its apogee or apex level with the latest meeting. Thank you so much, Jabin. It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for laying out the entire context and background of the Xi-Putin meeting and explaining the implications of it for the West and for India as well. Absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sampath. Pleasure.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.